So hi everyone, my name's Alexis. I'm a curator here at Hauser Wirth, and I had the privilege of getting to work on this show with Koji and Emily and the family, Candida and Becca and Jen and Peter and Luke. So thank you all for making this show happen. And thank you, Russell Salmon, for organizing today. And okay, we're going to begin. We're mic'd. If you can't hear us for any reason, just throw up your hands and we'll try and talk more in your direction. I'm going to introduce you, okay? You kind of don't need an introduction.
That's your job.
But I'm going to give you a brief one anyway. So Melvin Edwards is a sculptor. He's a pioneer in the history of contemporary art and sculpture, and he was born in Houston, Texas. He began his artistic career at the University of Southern California in LA, where he met and was mentored by the Hungarian painter Francis D'Erdely.
Yeah.
He learned to weld in 1960 from a guy named George Baker. And by 1965, he had his first solo show at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. I think that's called Precocious. 2 years later, Edwards moved to New York, and he quickly fell into a dynamic and diverse group of artists who were working across media and platform. Shortly after his arrival in New York, he exhibited at places like the Studio Museum. He was the first African-American sculptor to have a solo show at the Whitney in 1970, and he's continued to exhibit widely ever since, including a long-term display at Dia Beacon that's currently on view, which is how he and I met. Edwards' work reflects his engagement with the history of race, labor, and violence, as well as themes of the African diaspora. Making welding his preferred medium, his sculptures are studies in abstraction and minimalism, and they gesture towards figuration while often kind of frustrating narrative.
There's always an old friend somewhere.
Ranging from colorful painted sculptures that expand a modernist vocabulary, such as the one we have behind us, to barbed wire installations, to tangled amalgamations of agricultural and industrial elements. His work is distinguished by its formal simplicity and powerful materiality. And Melvin is as I said, a welder kind of par excellence. And so is Smith. And this show was organized to look at Smith's late sculpture. Late is a relative term. He died tragically early in 1965. But the works on view here are all from 1960 to 1965. And so I think it's a particularly exciting moment to have you here, because that's kind of your awakening into sculpture, that period.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to start by asking you, what drew you to welding, and when and how Smith entered your consciousness?
Well, can you hear me? I'm a little hoarse, so want to be sure. If there were liquid in it, I'd breathe better. I guess, well, first of all, I'll go back just a little further. 1955, 18 years old, I left Houston to live in Los Angeles with my aunt and uncle, and went to Los Angeles City College, which is a junior college, and for the first 2 years. And I was an art major immediately, but football was as important, if not more. I came from Texas, and anybody knows Texas and high school sports, and especially football, well, there's no religion that is higher. And I come from, my father played, and I know this isn't a David Smith question, but you'll see how it fits. My father and mother were athletes in the 1930s at high school, and then I went to the same high school they went, and they won state championship when my father played in 35, and we won state championship when I played in 1954. So, and that tradition continues, and I still call these 80-year-old, 86-year-old people, and we reminisce about that. One of the things that happened for me in that period, I always took art in junior high and high school. So art and painting were always there. Sports was always there. And I always liked to read. So, I guess I was a normal or semi-normal or whatever kind of a teenager. But the welding and the sculpture showed up. I wasn't particularly interested in sculpture originally. No, art was always painting. That's what it was, drawing. And we've been talking in the back room for a couple of hours, so maybe a lot of stuff that we could talk about now, we've already talked about in the back room.
Gonna make you repeat yourself.
Okay, well, but I saw the movie Moulin Rouge, if any of you know that. It was about Toulouse-Lautrec. I was a 16, 17-year-old in high school. I kept seeing the movie, going back and taking my sketchbook and doing drawings. I thought that, okay, I will be an artist, and I'll go to France, and I'll go to the Moulin Rouge, and I'll see naked ladies kicking high and drink cognac out of a cane and, die at 35 or something. Okay, I didn't go to Paris or any of that for many years, and I finally went to Moulin Rouge a year or so ago, and it's the same as a Rockefeller Center and the Rockettes. It's not the good old days. But in terms of sculpture, in 1958, I was at Los Angeles County Art Institute, which other people know as Otis Parsons. And you had to take sculpture. So I took a sculpture class, which basically the standard, there's a figure and you work based on the figure, and everybody in the class got judged. Since I was a scholarship student, I had to take the photographs of everybody's work, which allowed me to judge things a bit, but it was so the teacher could make judgments. Anyway, I left there and went back to the University of Southern California. I'm still a painting major, only took sculpture because I had to. But it was interesting when I took it. Anyway, I saw a couple of graduate students welding, and the welding interested me for some reason. And I asked one of them to teach me how to weld. And he said, okay, begrudgingly. He didn't really want to waste his time with me. But he laid out half a dozen pieces of steel, taught me how to gas weld them. And once I had the technique down enough, he said, you just keep doing this, and you keep trying different things with different pieces of steel, and that's it. That's the only formal teaching I ever had in terms of welding and stuff. Everything else you just taught yourself by circumstance through the years. And it let me know I could go to the scrapyard and buy steel. But I was still painting. Painting stayed with me until about 1965 or so. But sculpture started to take over in about 1963. The interest just got more serious. I bought my own welding equipment, and I'm a self-taught schoolboy kind of welder. I'm not like David Smith, who was trained industrial quality welder and could probably do much more sophisticated technical things than I could, But the art part, I would say this. I was advanced in my thinking about visual art in relation to the era. I knew what was going on in the art world, as you could in a big city like Los Angeles, next to New York, with the references to art history, And I had my interest in architects, Frank Lloyd Wright or you know. For me, Smith was in the books, but he wasn't that, he was rarely in the books in that period. There was an earlier generation of sculptors whose presence was there when I was being educated. Okay. But in around 1961 or 2, somewhere in there was an exhibition of his work at Everett Ellen Gallery.
1960.
Okay.
Yes.
I didn't see this show, but I did hear that it happened. Later on, I saw some photographs of it. The first major exhibition of his work that I saw was right around the time that he'd passed in '65. By then, I had just had my first one-man show and was teaching at the old Chenard Art School, which became known as Cal Arts now and stuff. And I took my students to see his work. And of course, that was the stainless steel works, the cubi, that group of works, all around the exterior of the museum. I was already aware, just by my understanding of art history, of the sculptors that were otherwise important in the era, and most of them, of course, were not welders. But in Los Angeles in that period, there had started to be some artists who were known for their welding. Oliver Andrews was a man who taught at UCLA. He wasn't my teacher because I was at USC, but I'd see the work in exhibitions. But always the conversation would go back when people had them to David Smith. In other words, it was like he was a transmission of what had happened in Europe with Gonzalez and others. He was the entry, I guess you'd call it subliminal or whatever, but for most of us about the potential in welding or constructing, emphasizing welding possibilities.
When you start the Lynch fragments in 1963, I mean, you've talked with Michael Brenson before in the Baum oral history about kind of tracing a lineage between Gonzalez, Smith's Medals of Dishonor, and your own work. I mean, you obviously were already aware of him as an artist, as a welder. Were you at that point aware of his more political work? I mean, the Medals of Dishonor being the most kind of...
Yeah. I wasn't aware of them, I don't think, until many years later. Nobody wrote anything about them, or at least that was published. And if you weren't here in the East or somewhere where you saw them, you just wouldn't know. But when I did, I just, my own putting me in the middle of, somebody who was subjectively doing something, because his Medals of Dishonor have nothing to do with welding, if you want to, talk about it. But, that's the other thing is, welding is a process like any process. If you get to do something with that process that's significant to what your idea of expressing something is, then it's fine. Otherwise, welding is just fixing stuff. Which ain't bad also,
Not so bad.
And plus, we live in a city and a civilization that's significantly welded, and everywhere in the world, and historically, you find that to work with steel, welding was not the earliest process. It's a tradition of steel working and forging and that sort of thing. In my own personal history, I didn't know it then, but one of my ancestors was a young adult African blacksmith, sold somewhere in the ports of New York to a family who took him to Alabama, and he worked in steel working on the plantation, lived to be about 105 years of age, but he had already been trained in metal working before he got, to the United States. Nobody ever told me that. I found out in the 1970s when my mother visited granduncle in the family, and he told her that story, and she said, well, that's what my son Mel does. Just, he said blacksmith, she said that's what Mel does. So,
sort of.
Later on, within a year or two, I did meet him, and he told me the same story.
Wow.
And stuff. So, and he had left Alabama as a young man and worked in the automobile industry, casting motors. So, working with steel is still in there in its various ways. But for Smith, when we say that, or when I say that, and then read that he worked for Studebaker and was constructing, well, the automobile industry, which is basically a 20th century industry, and metal sculpture in the sense of welding and constructing is basically a 20th century art, so in that respect, things coming together are natural.
Yeah, both. I think for him, and you've talked about once you started welding, the world of the welded world sort of appeared to you.
Oh yeah.
And having already been there, just kind of revealed itself.
Well, this is one I use all the time when I think of that. If you're driving your car and there's those big garbage trucks in front of you, the back end of it is nothing but a relief sculpture, welded, all welded, different configurations, but it's there. You could easily cut one off, hang it up in the museum wall, and you got a very good one.
That reminds me a little bit of the tank end. So this sculpture on the right side of the gallery, for us anyway, is called 90 Sun, and it features one of Smith's favorite motifs, which is the back of a water tank that he's cut off and welded.
Yeah. And they're water tanks, they're oil tanks, all kinds of tanks, and it's steel that's been wrapped like a piece of paper, but it's steel.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that because I find there's an almost ribbon-like quality to some of his work, and to yours as well. And I wanted to talk a little bit about scale, because both of you, you work on very different scales, but both of you take advantage of the way, welding is this kind of big process. You're holding a torch, right? You've got flame. But sometimes the kind of moment of contact is as small as a pinpoint, right? How do you think about that oscillation in scale in your own work and in relationship to others?
Well, from my point of view, it's just what's necessary or needed, and that's intuitive at the time. You know that whatever you're trying to join, you either wanted to be together for one reason or another. Sometimes it's appearance, sometimes it's balance, sometimes it's you want it taller than it is, Sometimes you want to join forms that ordinarily there'd be no reason for them to be together, And where that point of contact is, you tack it a little bit just to see what it feels like and looks like, and then if it's to be taken further, then you do what you consider is finished, and that varies with person to person, and even with the same person, depending on the subject at the moment, and that can be instantaneous, or it can be predetermined. It just depends on how you're working. Some works which are more, if you will, mechanically straight-lined, or a kind of natural presence, one part to another, you handle one way, and other parts you handle another way. And sometimes you make a mistake, and then you got to cut it apart, or you got to say, oh, that mistake is fine.
That mistake works.
It just varies on your approach. I'm not about to know necessarily how much pre-planning David Smith did for each piece and how much evolved in process, because that varies with various people and their approaches.
One thing that we know Smith was doing was, especially in this period in the 60s when he'd come back from Italy, he had all this extra material from Voltri. Smith had gone to Italy in 1962 to participate in the Spoleto Festival, and he accumulated a lot of material. He made 27 sculptures, accumulates a lot of material that he then brings home, makes another series of sculptures with. Anyway, there's some wonderful photographs of him working on the Voltri Bolton sculptures, kind of towing. So he's laying everything out and kind of kicking it around until he's come to a configuration that feels right for him. And that sort of, he would also draw, but that is the moment of creativity before he kind of commits to the welded suture. In your own work, you're also working with familiar form objects, as you've called them, found material that is kind of recognizable in some way. And you've talked about not working with drawing in advance. So what is the process that you come to, or you go through to come to a kind of a compositional?
It varies. It varies. Some things are, I have an idea of where I'm headed, and others I don't. Early on, just the materials, I went to the scrapyard and bought cutoffs of industrial materials. And this was Los Angeles, and just to give you an idea of a morning, I'd drive from the Crenshaw area that I lived in to East LA, which was industrial in Los Angeles, go to a scrapyard, get a pile of scrap steel, put in the station wagon. I'd stop at a certain restaurant on Central Avenue because it was a good soul food breakfast. And there was a Gordon's bookstore, which was a African-American focused bookstore. And buy books or magazines and things. And then go back to the studio and work. In terms of pre-planning, I tended early on to work small just because I was teaching myself. And in that respect, I came across a good feeling about composition and dynamics, that it didn't have to be bigger, that I was really getting some, what I'll call, content that felt good to me just by working that scale. And so it was good in retrospect, both for learning how to handle things, but also composition. And I've always been a person, whatever anyone might think of my work, some ideas of composition have stayed with me. It was there when I was painting, and it's still there in my intuition to this day. But if you ask me to say what it is, I don't know, in a certain sense, except it always felt right. And if something didn't feel right, I either would take it off or add something else and just keep developing. Try until it felt good, so to speak, is sort of my approach. The way you described what David Smith did, those were natural ways for anybody that worked. Of what I know and have read about him in the Spoleto experience, for him to have access to a whole factory and the kind of assistance you can have in a situation like was a real bonus for him. And it did help to facilitate the larger scale works, And those, of course, are extensions of other ideas or other ideas that just couldn't come out until you're working and thinking at that scale. And as far as the color, if you knew the history of contemporary sculpture, even in Smith's era, there were other people who had painted things. I can't remember his name, but there was a South American sculptor who was very well known for painted abstract sculpture in the 50s. There were others who were welding on the West Coast who you didn't hear about in the East, and even on the West Coast it was rare because it was a new set of processes. I'd say when I got introduced to welding in school in 1960 or so, it wasn't common. 5 years later, every college in America had a welding class. You know, I mean, the art departments, that was the way it went.
Yeah.
And, but who turned out to have significant ideas and ways of working, well, that depended on, you know, their own circumstance. For me, I realized I had to make a decision a bit about the three-dimensional world or the two-dimensional world of painting. And I remember, and I wish I could find what I wrote, but one day I sat down and I wrote something about what it meant to work in 3 dimensions as opposed to, you know, the two-dimensional world of painting. And you could say if you took this room as a cubic interior gallery space, that was my model for 3 dimensions. I knew the universe is much more than that, but just in terms of art world realities or the world that artists think in and are apt to have their work go into, and so the floor, the ceiling, the walls, you know, all of them were places or area defining devices that you could use. And I remember the space that I had, which was a storefront, and it had been given to me by, or rented to me by, the landlord of the building, who had a ceramics factory and business, and he had been living in this place. So but he decided to move upstairs to one of the apartments so I and my family could have this storefront. And the ceilings were not quite as high, but almost as high as that. But in the center was a huge Japanese paper lantern in oval shape. And it dominated in a certain way, but it was high enough, it was out of the way. And I remember sitting on the floor with my daughter, and this is California, and all of a sudden the environment kicked in. What I mean by that is she was about 2 or 3 years old, and all of a sudden there was a sound of thunder and lightning. Well, she had never heard thunder before in her life. In other words, California, it often didn't rain, you know, at periods of time. And we were both looking at the lantern at the time, and thunder was, and she said, "Daddy, what's that?" "Who's that?" No, she didn't say, "What's it?" "Who's that?" You know, something like that. Well, you could say, what does that have to do with sculpture? It's the three-dimensional or maybe the multi-dimensional world that we live and think in, and where our imagination goes. And at that point, hers is just as valid as mine, you know, or mine hopefully is as valid as hers, you know. Yeah. What does that have to do with David Smith? Well, I've had the pleasure today of meeting his daughters who are here, you know, and I had to say to them, well, I have daughters too, so I know how important that can be, you know, and what you get from it is intangible, you know. What does that have to do with welding and hammering, using an anvil and all of that? Your heart's in it. I mean, that's my notion. If your heart's not in it, what are you doing it for, you know? And so, art world-wise, yeah, we can talk about the mechanics or the dynamics, the critical this and that, but for whatever internal reason that allows you to do what you're doing and then do more and then keep doing more. You couldn't have told me when I was 26 that I'd be doing this at 86, you know. I remember the year again, that David Smith passed, and it was the first year I was teaching at CalArts, and taking my students there. And looking back, I said, well, he really died as a young man.
Yeah.
You know, that if he'd gotten 20 more years to work, it would have been very interesting to see what he would have done with it. You know.
I think for this show that's particularly relevant because we're talking about late work within the context of a life cut short.
Sure.
But I think you just said two things that I think are really important for me for this show. One is the importance of one's personal life in one's work, and Smith rarely put his own autobiography in his work, but the work opens up. It's breathier or looser in a way in this late period in the 60s. And it's also often, anyway, in its titling, more personal. So this is the period in which Smith starts to name sculptures after his daughters. And we have Rebecca Circle over there as a kind of example of that. So that one's life seeps into one's work in ways that are important. But also he's making work in a way that contends with the environment. His environment was Bolton Landing. It was the landscape of the sort of upper Hudson Valley, sort of upstate New York. Landscape yours was the more urban context of LA. But one thing Smith talked a lot about in thinking through that relationship between 2 and 3 dimensions is that the history of sculpture is the history of painting, and that the two are actually not so distinguishable from each other. And so you see, he's thinking about a long art history in that context, much longer than sort of post-war abstraction. And so you see work that is either painted in a practical way, because covering steel stops rust or things like that, or painted in a way that's clearly more expressive, as in things like the zigs. Your first works were also painted. I mean, you covered them in a black lacquer, right?
Some.
Yeah. Were you thinking about that long arc of art history, or did you come to the application of color in a different way?
I always thought sooner or later, once I was focused primarily on sculpture, that color would come in at some point. I didn't know how. And the need for preventing rust or minimizing it, I didn't think about it much. But then a couple of pieces that I made that were a little larger than the others, it felt right to at least paint them with black, make them all over black. Kind of like if you went into any metalworking place, the work tables or the equipment or stuff, they'd be just functionally painted black. So they would do what they did and they didn't deteriorate. But you could see graphically what they were and that kind of thing. The piece called the Lifted X, which was made in 1965 and was the largest piece, the largest freestanding piece in my first one-man show. The title came from the political person Malcolm X, because while I was working on this particular work, which was for my one-man show, my first one-man show, and I heard that he'd passed, and there were certain dynamics of politics and stuff that interested me from him, and so I said, well, he's transitioned, he's lifted, so to speak. That's literal. But what I did within the sculpture itself was construct a hard-to-see kind of X structure at the bottom, which came literally from him being called Malcolm X. But and inside of it, one of the smaller pieces called the lynch fragments, I had one of them embedded inside the piece. You hardly can see it, but it's there. And this was literally titled on February the 21st, 1965, because that's the day of his death. My memory's not quite that good, but And the piece is, a few years ago, got purchased by the Museum of Modern Art. And so 1965 to 20-something, it's a long day to wait for your payday.
As long as it comes.
Well, if you read some of the books about Smith and his understanding that, hey, it costs to do this stuff, and there's dynamics involved. The other quick one that you mentioned was his relationship to daughters and titling. I never named one of mine Anna, Margit, or Alma, which are the names of my 3 daughters, but I did when 2 of them, they're twins, and so there is one small lynch fragment that's called Geminas, which is Spanish for twins. And the reason for that is I happened also to be taking a Spanish class at UCLA at the time, and my educational experience is a bit skewed. I didn't go 1, 2, 3, 4th through college, and they let me in without a foreign language because I was an athlete, but they wouldn't let me out without it. So I had to go back at night, and I was taking Spanish when my twins were born at the same time. So now, if you want to put that combination of aesthetic dynamics together and say it's logical that he made this or that, you're better than me.
Well, you also made Anna's Corner.
That's true.
The barbed wire piece.
That's true, but that's a little later. Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna open this up to questions, but I just want to play one really quick game with you really, really quickly. So in 1956, Smith gave a lecture at Skowhegan where he only asked questions to the audience rather than lecturing. And I pulled just a couple of my favorite questions for you, and I want you to answer them, not quite yes or no, but yes or no style.
No
just
problem.
3 of them. Do you make art your life, that which always comes first and occupies every moment, the last problem before you sleep, the first awakening vision?
Say that again.
Do you make art your life, that which always comes first and occupies every moment, the last problem before sleep, and the first awakening vision?
I've never rated where I put art.
Okay.
It's just been an essential part of my life, all of my life, and all of my adult life. Until I left and stopped playing football, it was second place, no question. I did enjoy playing football, no question. I love to hit people.
And there's a quality of movement in your work.
That's a nice interpretation.
1 or 2 gut punches in there.
But what I mean is, I think I got lessons of balance and how spaces are handled. See, in sports, you have to be just as aware of space in order to do what you do, in order to do it. And in visual art, you have to be aware of space as well.
Absolutely.
I think that's the work of David Smith that's here, which is, for the most part, fairly flat.
Very planar.
You know, and in that respect, it was an approach and a way of handling the materials, you know. But once it's presented, it's clearly a way of handling space. And it is either complementary to the fact that we're usually showing art in walled spaces, which are flats, so to speak. I don't know how much that resonates with other people, but for myself, for instance, the linear pieces where I use diagrams that are linear, using the barbed wire in order to have a different kind of, if you will, drawing in space. You know, and I think drawing in space, painting in space when it's color, you know, all of those are things that Smith had considered in his own ways, and others as well, you know. And I would love to see an exhibition that juxtaposed Smith with maybe 20 artists, especially of his era and a little earlier.
Let's do it.
You know.
You tell me which artist.
You know, but you know, and in that sense, I think an understanding. You know,
Yeah.
much has happened since then, of course, which has other ramifications. But then, you know, everything is relativity anyway.
One thing you said when we were in the back before we started is, you know, all these years later, you look around and sculptures come and gone and woven around many different places, but you bump into Smith kind of everywhere you go.
Yeah, well.
I thought that was...
Well, at one point, I don't know who made the reference, but he said that Smith's approach to shape and things was like street signs. Every intersection, there's going to be some kind of thing that directs you to the right, the left, to pause or this or that. And if you look at what those signs are shaped like, then, well, art always was the square, the circle, and the triangle, you know. And I guess universality is the word that people use, but certainly natural presence in all the things that we do. And I always like to say, well, most experiences are sculptural. You're in this room and it's a certain amount of that.
Yeah.
You have to go to that little room, that little cubic in the negative area, and then the doors open and you go into a smaller cubic, you know. And I'm kind of playing with cubic and cubi.
I got
because,
you.
Okay, you know.
Melvin, would you be okay to take one or two questions from the audience?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I'm going to point him out because I know who he is.
You're going to let him speak? Okay.
So, great, Melvin. Great to see you and great talk.
Same here.
While you were talking, I was sort of reflecting on, I remember when Michael Steiner formed Millville Art Systems, and artists started to turn to fabrication as opposed to process, and I think that had something also to do with the advent of volumetric sculpture and minimal sculpture. Did that ever occur to you, or is there anything that you want to talk about in terms of fabrication versus process?
Well, fabrication is a natural, as far as I could see. In the case of Smith, we'll use the example of the Spoleto-Voltri situation, where when he was in Italy, and he had this factory space and assistance to make what he wanted to make. And it, of course, expanded the scale and some of the ideas he could have, you know. In my own case, the turn to fabricators, the first very large pieces that I made in my own studio in Plainfield with the use of a couple of assistants and stuff. In fact, one of my assistants had worked for some sculptor in Indiana who, and he knew much more about that kind of fabrication than I did, though I was his teacher, you know, so to speak. But nothing goes on in fabrication that I didn't already know, but had not worked at that scale. After making that first large, well, it wasn't the first, but primarily significant large-scale work, which is in Columbus, Ohio. Okay. It's in Columbus, Ohio.
I know, so loud.
And it's called Out of the Struggles of the Past to a Brilliant Future. It was an African-American community in Columbus in the years when they were redeveloping various areas of various cities. And the people of this community decided they wanted a work of art to commemorate that they were, you know, redeveloping the community. And the buildings were interesting architecture. One 13-story building for ordinary, what we call ordinary families, one for senior citizens, and another for commercial aspects. And they had architecturally made about 200-foot area circular that could hold water if they wanted, and they did for ice skating in the winter. But anyway, I made this very large piece of sculpture, stainless steel. It was the first major stainless piece that I had constructed because it was appropriate material for the outdoors. I found that very useful. I'm going to extend the question a little bit. As I was doing some polishing, the piece was basically up and finished. And a lady and her son who lived in the complex came through, and she saw me run. She said, "Hey, mister," she said, "tell me something. Whose monstrosity is this?" And I said, she didn't know I was just a worker. I said, "Well, to tell you the truth, it's mine." She said, "Oh, it's very beautiful." So if you have ideas of public art, you automatically see what it goes through. It goes through the realities of human experience.
Yeah.
And the truth is, later on, I went back to Columbus, and the nameplate on there was not mine. It was some bronze dedicated to the mother. I can't remember the name, but it's the mother of the boxer who knocked out who's the Brooklyn boxer who was so famous about 30 years ago? Tyson. Uh-huh. Yeah, well, whoever the guy was, surprisingly knocked Tyson out. His mother lived in this building, so he dedicated my sculpture by putting a bronze plaque to her. Well, what I'm trying to say is public art is subject to public life.
Yeah.
And all of the sculptors that I know, from David Smith, Richard Hunt, you name them, all over the world, if your work is going to be out there in the world, it will live in the world as the world is. If there's war, it will be war. If there's peace, there'll be peace. If there's all of those things, we're in the middle of it. And working in steel, oh yeah, skateboards, I got. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think with that, just in the interest of time, we're going to take informal questions now. But
Sure.
we'll call that, and I want to say thank you, Melvin, so much for coming and talking to us. Thank you.